All right, welcome to Truth Be Told. This is Tony Sweet, Captain Ron over here. We have a great show for you guys today, and we're so excited to have our guest on. We haven't really done a show for the last month, so this is a great way to get us back started for February. We have Dr. Jeff Meldrum. He is a professor of anatomy and if I can say this right, because my country education doesn't work as well. Anthropology at the Idaho State University. He is, which is a occupational and physical therapy, a professor of occupational physical therapy. Meldrum is an expert on foot morphology. That's a new one because I don't even know what the hell that is. So we're going to find out what and locomotion in primates. He's a world leader in authority on Sasquatch. So we welcome to the show, Truth Be Told, Dr. Meldrum. How you doing?
Hey, thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Well, we're excited to have you here. We're ready to get February started with a great show like yourself. We haven't really had many people on in the last probably year or so about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the Yeti, whatever you want to call it. But Ron, I'm going to have you get started.
Well, why don't we ask the doctor? I know you've been doing this a long time. We're really honored to have you on today.
We are honored, yes.
And after studying this for so long, what do you actually think that Sasquatch is? Why don't we just start there and jump right in?
Well, it's I think it's a biological species. I'm not one to, obviously, given my grounding in science, to leap to paranormal or extraordinary explanations. I think that that the apparently novel features of Sasquatch can be explained as its by its rarity, its difficulty or ability to elude us, our difficulty in pinning it down. I conceive of it as a species of large-bodied primate, an ape, or perhaps an early hominid offshoot of our closer kin, the hominin family tree, but a very early one. A species that doesn't show any of the material culture we associate with Homo or any of those higher cognitive abilities. Now, I know there are people who take exception to that, who think very differently, who view these as forest people, as some sort of idyllic, form of if not human, near human. But I see them as a subhuman. And by sub, I simply mean in the taxonomic order of things, not to put a value judgment on any species.
Dr. Meldrum, I have a question because, there's been studies for years, years and years and years about Sasquatch. Has the research changed with technology? You can't be using the same research that you used 50 years ago. What type of technology that you use now to do your research, and maybe you've seen other people change their,
Sure.
their practice?
Well, certainly there have been advances in a number of different areas. For example, DNA and the ability to acquire a genomic DNA sequence for a species in very short order and very economically. That poses a real opportunity if we can get that elusive bit of tissue, hair or skin or blood, that will allow us to do that. One of the exciting things now that is coming to the fore is something called eDNA, environmental DNA, the ability to use highly automated technologies to examine a large sample or a large array of DNA samples from a single soil sample or water sample. And that may help us out tremendously, because one of the challenges we've had with any DNA study, particularly those that are focused on hair, which we can, more confidently identify as a primate hair, human-like, distinguish it from other common forms of wildlife out there. One of the characteristics of the alleged Sasquatch hair is that it lacks a cellular medulla. It lacks the stacked cells up through the cortex, which would be the source of DNA, the source of nuclei and mitochondria of degraded cells there. So getting DNA from hair has been very challenging. eDNA, on the other hand, would primarily rely on sources of DNA, most likely sloughed skin cells, for example. I'm involved with a project under the auspices of the Olympic project there in Washington, where they're investigating some remarkable ground nests that, for all intents and purposes, look like gorilla nests. But here they are in the Olympic Peninsula, in the Olympic Forest. Well, we've sampled some soil from the center of those nests, and if we are lucky, we might be able to find some DNA of a non-human primate. And in this case, if that, or that's more likely to happen, because if there is tissue from a sleeping Sasquatch, it's going to be sloughed skin cells. So there'll be lots of mitochondria and DNA that will allow us to get at the genome of that species. So that's very exciting.
That is
great.
Hey,
some results.
Doc, what about this 5-year study from Dr. Ketchum that I didn't know that you couldn't get that from hair? I thought she was using hair samples. Isn't that true?
Yeah, that's what she claimed.
And so what do you think of that study? Is it just garbage, or is there anything of value in there?
That's the short answer, pretty much.
Okay,
right
I didn't want to.
Yeah, it was. There were all sorts of red flags and oddities in her behavior and her approach to the problem, her choice of samples, her claims about the samples, the central role that a gentleman, I use that word loosely there, Justin Schmea played in the whole scheme of things. Who claimed to have shot a Sasquatch and as well as a full adult, as well as an infant or juvenile. And anyway, it's a long story, but absolutely pretty much all garbage. Yeah.
You want to say
No reliable data has come from that study, and it has been criticized very heavily. It has never been published. It won't be published, not because of claims, but because of the methodology. Probably the best review has been published, best review of that study, and its purported data and results was published in the journal that I edit, the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, and you can read about that there if you go to www.isu.edu/RHI, which has lots of other articles, interesting articles about various aspects of the research. It's a journal I started, a bona fide peer-reviewed journal with an editorial board, and that provides a platform, a venue for scholarly papers that often don't find a sympathetic platform elsewhere. They don't find the ability to get published in mainstream journals because they simply won't touch the subject. Sight unseen, they won't touch the subject. So,
well, everybody knows. I mean, it's like close. I think it is the 50th anniversary or close to the 50th anniversary of the Patterson-Grimley film. But I mean, to that point, really, that's the only like visual evidence that we on film. But is there what do you think is the best evidence for Sasquatch is?
Well, that as you said, we just passed in 1967. The Patterson-Gimlin film was shot, so 2017 marked the 50th anniversary, and after 50 years, that still stands as the best film evidence for Sasquatch. There are a few other bits of film out there, some that are intriguing. The Freeman footage I think is still quite intriguing. Of late, some of the things offered by Todd Standing from Alberta, Canada, have remained controversial, but some of them are quite intriguing. Some I have reservations about, or questions remain in my mind. For me, when I'm asked that question, what's the best evidence? Obviously, there's going to be bias depending on the frame of reference of the person asking or answering that question. In my case, given my expertise in, as you said earlier, foot morphology, which is going beyond just the anatomy and evaluating the shape and how evolution has shaped that foot, adapted it to a particular mode of locomotion. In this case, walking upright, a large, heavy, bipedal ape walking on two legs. Because of that expertise, for me, by far, the most overwhelmingly convincing data take the form of the footprints. I have in my lab now over 300 footprint casts.
Wow.
And hundreds of photographs of footprints, and a remarkably consistent and rational model of the Sasquatch foot, one that is elegantly adapted to the habitat these creatures are reportedly inhabit, as well as being consistent with, our notions of how foot evolution might have progressed from an ancestor with a grasping, hand-like hind foot to one that now is utilized in terrestrial locomotion, walking on the ground on two legs. I mean, it's just remarkably compelling. The hair data is also very interesting. There we've got physical evidence. I was once accosted by a former department chairman who chided me with the statement that, after all, Jeff, these are just stories. And I said, well, stories that shed hair, that void scat, that leave footprints that are seen by credible witnesses, that feature prominently in Native American traditions for generations. So it's a lot more than just stories.
Right. Before we get more into the prints, I want to ask you this about. Okay, we're talking about the Patterson film, which I think is extremely credible, and there's a lot of these guys that's been under a lot of scrutiny. That film, that little 1 minute of footage, has had a lot of study. It's been digitized. I think you did a special with National Geographic where they did a 3D thing, and you could see it from all angles, like being inside the footage. It's incredible how scrutinized it is. Then there's guys like Bill Mums and stuff that they come away after studying it saying that it's a biological creature.
Right.
Is that how you feel the film is as well?
Oh, definitely. I early on when I was involved in this topic, this line of investigation, I was somewhat reluctant to put too many eggs in that one basket. I thought it was, it would potentially be a handicap. But the more opportunity I had to study it and to reevaluate, having gotten acquainted very, very closely with Bob Gimlin, counting him as a friend and more than just an acquaintance, you can't spend 5 minutes with that guy and not come to the conclusion that he's just a straight arrow. I mean, he's telling his experience as he remembers that experience.
Right. He's never wavered from it either, which is great. And, here's the thing that I thought of the other day when I was preparing for this show, and it's something I haven't really heard someone say before. We watch a lot of this stuff on this show that we talk about, and all the footage we see is this crappy, grainy thing, and the camera's moving, and they're all horrible. And I thought to myself, okay, in 1967, let's just for one quick second say these guys are going to perpetrate a hoax. The creature that's in this thing looks amazing. I mean, in 1967, that's a year before the Planet of the Apes came out, and you can see those are the top Hollywood guys. Yeah. That looks horrible compared to this.
Oh, yeah.
This footage looks amazing, and yet they did it with this shaky cam running and all that. You think they could have done a locked-off, beautiful shot because they could have never anticipated that we would have been able to digitize the footage and make it stabilized and all that. And a lot of times people do that to cover up the shortcomings, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Make it just a little bit blurry, just a little bit out of focus and jiggling around. Yeah. And that's a misconception that a lot of people have out there, because all they've seen is the several of the broadcast versions of the film, which is a VHS copy that's been licensed by Mrs. Patterson, and it's time has taken its toll on it. When you realize that he shot that film with a fixed focused lens, that means anything that was 2 or 3 feet in front of the lens out to infinity was in focus. So the only blur is a little bit of motion blur, because he was running, as you said, across that creek and running towards it, and there's the gyration and the bouncing, but the lack of sharp clarity of the image is simply due to the extreme enlargement that we often subject it to, because it was a distance off. And, it's a 2 millimeter object on a 16 millimeter film frame.
Right.
With and film, not a digital camera, but the grainy emulsion of a film exposed there. And so, if you I can show you stills captures from that the earlier copies of that film that are just amazing. When you see them, your jaw drops.
Wow.
Most people don't realize how much information can be gleaned from that film. And having now had the opportunity to study that in great detail, to work with Bill Munns on several of his projects, to see the enhancements that have been done through color channel splitting of the digitized image, so that the sharpest wavelengths of color that were in greatest focus on that film are highlighted. I mean, I sit and I show this a stabilized clip that I have of the color channel split image, and I show it to my students, my anatomy students, and I have them go through from the head to the toes and pick up every feature, every landmark, every muscle mass, every tendon that they can pick out. And first of all, they're flabbergasted when they see it this way for the first time. But as they begin to recognize all of the detail of anatomy, there's one frame where there's a little gap in the obstructing log she's walking behind, and you can see all the way down past the knee in perfect side view. And right there on the side, just below her knee or behind her knee, you can see the tendon of the biceps femoris. The students pick that out. They notice it. They see it. You don't see details like that in a padded costume with foam rubber that didn't hardly exist in 1967.
Okay, you've got me to the meat question that I was going to save for later. I'm going to jump right into this, Doc, because
go for it, Ryan.
I agree with you. I think that you could see the muscle move. There's no way, certainly in 1967, let alone today, there's just too much of the anatomy that seems incredible. So I would agree with you that I would believe that's a biological creature on the Patterson film, and to me that's an anomaly. It's incredible. Here's my problem and the big question for you, Doc. It seems that this belief in a hairy wild man has been all over the world. We've got orang pendek, we've got urine, you've got all these different things. We also have 7 billion people in the world, and now we have 5 billion of those people all have a camera with them all the time. So it's shocking to me. We just talked about it's been 50 years since the Patterson film. It's very hard for me to believe that in 50 years somebody hasn't got another piece of 1 minute footage of something anywhere near this quality.
Right. Well, to go back to the beginning of your statement, the diversity of hominoids, relic hominoids around the world, and there are several, and this is an interesting thing. But it actually jives very nicely with current thinking in anthropology, because we recognize that in the past that family tree was remarkably bushy, much bushier, and it gets bushier with every new discovery, adding more and more species, so that at any slice of time in the past, there were multiple species of relic hominoids or of hominins coexisting across the landscape. And then the flip side of that coin is that many of these branches have persisted far more recently than had ever been appreciated previously. So as you mentioned, you mentioned the orang pendek. There may be, or the Homo Floresiensis was just discovered, which is very tempting to this little diminutive hominin on the island of Flores in Indonesia, in places where reports of not the orang pendek, but the natives there call it the ibu gogo. And it has the same description, the ibu gogo and dutu, orang pendek, just depending on which island you're on, what language group you're working with.
But nobody has a picture of it, or a video of it. I mean,
those people, it's not surprising that they don't. Obviously, but you're right. Now, it's interesting though that and if you frequent the internet and Facebook and such, or YouTube, you see lots and lots of various snippets.
They're always garbage, and they're always behind a tree, and it's always blurry, and it's always a black mark, and he says that could be him. Really? Well, it could be. It could also be nothing.
Oh, yeah, you're right. You're right, but I was going to point out that there was, and I'm not sure if it's there anymore. Honestly, I haven't looked. It was called Facebook Find Bigfoot, and it was a site that was created inviting people to submit their snippets and so forth. Many of which weren't taken intentionally. They noticed something in the background behind what they're taking the picture of. That's kind of an interesting twist on it. But the point is, you're right. Any one of them by itself, and you would just simply kind of label it as garbage. But when you start to see, as the manager of that site, based on some criteria that he developed after examining lots of these, he began to rank them. And when you examine the top 20, it's really quite interesting how many consistent features are subtly present in those, which, I guess you could just chalk it up to a coincidence that people who are going to try to fake a Bigfoot are going to make it look a certain way. The head sitting on these broad shoulders, thick body.
Right. It's in the subculture enough now that we all know what a Bigfoot looks like, so I'd make it look like that, right? I mean, that's natural. Sure.
But having said that, the costumes, the off-the-shelf costumes that are available to most of the general public are a far cry from, even the Philip Morris who claimed that he made the Sasquatch
50 years ago, sure.
Yeah, but you're right. We have this perennial problem with camera traps. You have all these people out there with smartphones and digital cameras and such. You have to wonder. One factor to bear in mind, and that is that most of these encounters are remarkably brief. Even this one with Roger Patterson, it only lasted 60 seconds. That would probably seem like an eternity to them at the time.
Sure.
But had he not been so adept at recovering from that falling horse and snatching his camera out of the saddlebag, a maneuver that he had actually practiced repeatedly so that he could do it, and had the fortitude to run after it, taking film as he was running, we may not have had more than just a parting glimpse of a tiny little blob squatch disappearing into the woods.
We also have
it was a remarkable set of circumstances. But my point is, most encounters are remarkably brief. Most people are not out there for the direct purpose of trying to capture a Sasquatch on camera. As I said, many of these are happenstance, and so it just kind of reveals that people don't have the composure, the presence of mind in the heat of the moment, and most people are lousy photographers.
And you just hit on exactly what I wanted to ask you next, Doctor, is that we've got all these TV shows, too. There's a couple there's that Finding Bigfoot that's been on for, 10, 12 years or something?
Right.
So they've got this show. They go out there and they hunt for Bigfoot. We had one of the guys on here. Somebody came on and he was telling me how he goes out all the time. And by the end of the show, I literally said to him, I go, why do you keep going? You've got nothing. 10 years they've been doing that show. They really have nothing. Yes, somebody threw a rock at them. Yes, they heard a noise in the background. That's not really much to hang a hat on, I got to be honest.
Oh, I agree with you there. I mean, it's on the show, you've got to bear in mind that the show is not a scientific undertaking. It's there for entertainment.
But if a Bigfoot walked up on him, it would change immediately if a real one did, right?
Yeah. Oh, it definitely would. It definitely would. There's no question.
But also,
I must admit, I don't have cable TV, and I've only seen a handful of episodes. Cliff was nice enough to share some recordings with me, so I could get a better sense of what was going on. But they had kind of a formulaic approach to things that maybe got a little worn out and constrained them, unfortunately. In early talks about the conception of that show, the initial proposal was to have a sustained, 2-year long expedition that was documented throughout, and that would be the substance of the program. But that's terrifying to the networks.
Right.
They need to have some assurance that they can have something in the can on a very fixed schedule, and that there will be content in each of those episodes. And so that dictated this flitting around like a butterfly from one site to another And even when there was a prospect of something interesting coming to light, they pack up and head to the next location. So that's the problem. I mean, if we ever get to the point where we can finance a sustained, ongoing presence and utilize some of these more advanced and innovative techniques, I mean, the whole area of aerial survey combined with thermal imaging is one that has to be explored. And there's all sorts of logistical and practical aspects that are obstacles to that. eDNA affords a real important way to get at this. But you're right. You know, when you talked about the same techniques, it was interesting. I watched a show that featured an early investigator from back in the 70s, Robert Morgan. And the documentary was sort of self-produced, and so you had a little more creative control and so forth. But I was bemused by the fact that they were experimenting with new types of camera traps, tripwire cameras, and they were, they didn't have access to night vision, but they were doing night observations and whatnot. And they were doing basically the same kind of bush beating and prospecting and shoe leather on the ground that we rely a lot on.
And he had nothing, and he never came away with anything, right? Well, nothing's a little strong, but he never came away with anything substantial.
Well, I always say it's like buying a lottery ticket. Why do people keep buying lottery tickets if they don't constantly win? They may win $1 or $2, but they keep buying it. So I guess that's that same attitude. It's like one day.
In my case, I've heard it. I've had it throw rocks. Them. Let's not make so there's no misconception about it. I've found tracks. I've found signs that you would expect for an animal. I recognize and that in my mind, in my opinion, based on the evidence I've examined, these animals are very rare.
Right.
This is not without going through a whole exercise, considering a whole number of variables and from social structure and habitat and rainfall, productivity, etc., population centers. Looking at the state of Idaho, I would come up with a population of Sasquatch in the range of 100 to 200.
Wow.
Wow. Now listening, Todd Standing and even Ketchum, they both say around 15,000 total population. What are your feelings on that?
Right.
I don't think you could support that. And anyway, I wouldn't even worry about what Melba Ketchum says.
Right. We've already covered it. Right.
She's having romantic relations with one. So
there you go.
But no, I think when I have the opportunity to demonstrate how I come up with those numbers, I just spoke over in Washington, and so I did the exercise that I worked out with some slides for Idaho, but then I switched over to Washington and said, to the audience, you probably think, oh well, that's Idaho, but Bigfoot is more concentrated in Washington. So I did the same exercise with Washington, came up with maybe 50% more, and that was it. So in all of the state of Washington, I would predict that there's maybe 200 to 400, but there's 35,000 black bear in Washington. Now, how often do you go out on a weekend and get a photograph of a black bear?
Right, true.
If
not very often.
Hiker, or even a hunter, unless they're baiting or they've got dogs or they, even black bear are remarkably elusive. I've got a book on the shelf. It's all about black bear natural history, and the title is "The Shadow in the Forest." Because they're very good at staying away, and that's 100 times more animals than what we're talking about with Sasquatch, and a third of the intelligence, perhaps, is what Sasquatch may have.
I want to
par with the gorilla or chimpanzee.
I'd like to go back to the Patterson film real quick,
yep.
And with your your ability to the movement, because I'm showing the video right now just so people can see it that are watching on YouTube. Well, you're saying it's a primate, and most primates, they can walk on, 2 feet, but they also go on 4s. Have you ever seen a Sasquatch?
Right there.
Right. No, the markings of maybe 2 feet, 2 hands on the ground, or is it always 2 feet?
No, we have hand prints and even knuckle prints,
fist
prints.
Right.
the side of the fist as they were, getting up like that. But they're a fraction of the imprints of feet. That in itself may say a lot about the way they get around. It's mostly bipedal. Now their limb proportions are different than ours. If we take the Patterson-Gimlin film subject as an average or a typical kind of Sasquatch, her interlimb index or intermembral index, which is just simply the ratio of shoulder to wrist to hip to ankle, is closer to, it's about 90 plus. That means her upper limb is 90% of the length of the hind limb. If you were to take into account the shoulder blade contribution to the extension of the forelimbs, they could be really close. Humans, on the other hand, are about 70. So if we
Right.
get down on all fours with our legs relatively extended, we look like a stink bug, with our rear end sticking up in the air. A bear crawl, it's called. Little kids, small infants that still have fairly short legs for their body size, before they first start walking bipedally, some get up off of their knees and do that kind of beetle crawl, and it's that would be what a Sasquatch would probably look like if it did go down on all fours. Meaning, given their limb proportions, they could probably run on all fours a lot more easily than we could. But I don't think they're certainly not adapted for that being the principal mode of locomotion, and the evidence in the form of handprints doesn't seem to support that.
Okay, well, now that we're on the prints again, what about these feet? How can you tell and discern that this is a real creature and not a hoax? Like, is it the dermal ridges on there? And are you able to tell enough that you could recognize that print and then maybe find it again, that same exact creature was walking elsewhere?
Right. So let's see where to begin. The dermal ridges are while they're fascinating, are very infrequent. Of the 300 casts, only about a half dozen examples with clear, discernible ridge detail are to be had. And that's simply because you have to have a substrate that has a fine enough particulate size that it will pick up that fine detail on the surface. It's just like when you take, how many pixels do you have in your camera?
Right.
If you don't have enough pixels to see the pinstripes on the suit, they're not going to show up. Same analogy. But then even if it transfers to the substrate, it has to survive long enough for someone to discover it before weathering obliterates it, or even just gravity. And then you have to have someone that's familiar enough with the technique of making a plaster cast that they don't obliterate it with the process of pouring plaster into the cast. If they think to consolidate it if necessary beforehand. So dramatic lithics are neat, though, or fascinating. When they're visible, it's stunning. I've had that opportunity to see tracks. The first tracks that I witnessed in the field were so fresh, you still could see ridge detail.
Wow.
But by the time, because of the drizzly, rainy weather, by the time we got back with materials to cast them, none of it transferred to the casts which I collected. All right. So how do you tell? There are a number of objective ways, and then there are a number of I don't want to say subjective because they're not fully subjective, but it's a gestalt. It's a feeling. When you're so familiar with something, you've seen footprints so often, you look at a footprint and it looks natural. That is, the details of anatomy that I'm expecting are there and they're visible to my eye, and so it looks right. The way the toes are articulated, the flexion points, the feature outline shape that identify things like the tuberosity on the fifth metatarsal, or this, that, or the other. All kinds of navicular tuberosity. Those things show up in tracks and are visible. Also, then, when you have a living foot, the imprint. Remember, the imprint is not the perfect shape of the foot itself, but rather it's the record of the foot interacting with the substrate. And so when there are tension cracks and pressure ridges and slide-ins or twisting features that are all indicative of a print that is part of a spontaneous, real trackway. Those features jump out. When some of the examples of obvious hoaxes, I mean, one, for example, comes to mind. You can clearly see how the individual has used their hand to kind of push in around the edge. They don't have the mass to imprint the entire footprint surface. And so what you get is this margin that's pushed in differentially, and the entire inside is humped up, hardly imprinted at all. And in this one case that I'm thinking of, I mean, the proportions are wrong. The toes don't articulate. I mean, they're not attached to the shank of the foot properly. And the toes look just like someone's fingers, even with streak marks where they have, tried to smooth out the impression and deepen their own finger imprints.
That is, I'm looking at some of the articles that you sent me and some of the tracks, and I'm showing it to our audience. And it is pretty amazing to, and I'm sure it's pretty when you walk up on this and find this for the first time. What was your first impression the first time you ever saw a Bigfoot marking or a footprint?
Well, yeah, the first time seeing them in the ground was pretty stunning. I mean, the gentleman who showed these to me, Paul Freeman, I had been given an earful of advice about his character and lack of trustworthiness, et cetera, et cetera. That this was a hoaxer, and so I went out there with a bit of a of a skeptical eye when and especially given the remarkable coincidence that he had fresh tracks to show me when I just happened to stop in for a visit. And it was a totally unannounced, unscripted visit, and I was literally kind of pinching myself. And then it starts to sink in as you see these details. You see the spontaneity, and at the time, literally the hair stood up on the back of my neck because when you see something, well, the experience that I can kind of relate it to. There's two. One is the first time you pick up a fossil that you find in the field, and you realize that's the remains of a living creature, one that may have lived 30 million years ago. The other is and that in the past I've compared to the first time I went panning for gold, the American River in Northern California, and you're sitting there swishing around. And boy, you find that little flake of gold in there, and you get the fever.
I bet.
Just like that kind of sensation. But no, it was really quite astounding. And as I've told people in the past, I had that moment of reflection, of introspection, because this experience came right on the heels of spending some time with Grover Krantz up in Pullman, Washington. We were on our return trip from a visit to his lab for the first time, and I was full aware, having followed Grover's career with interest, his pursuit of this question, but knowing the impact on his professional career, and then contemplating the implications of these footprints in front of me, and literally, the little imp on the shoulder saying, "Do you really want to go down this path? You're going to jump in this rabbit hole?"
Right.
And then the other one saying, "How can you not? How could you walk away from this? This is they really do exist, like Santa Claus meeting the two M&Ms. They really do exist."
Hey Doc, let me ask you this then. What do you think of Todd Standing? I know you did that film with him last year, and he has some interesting photos as well.
4 years ago.
And I think it came out though. Didn't it come out a year in 2017?
Well, it just came out. The Netflix one just came out just a couple months ago.
Yeah.
Todd invited me up to see his site and to consider his evidence. Invited me on his dime. He flew me up and put me up and and hosted me out in the field along with Dr. Bindernagel. So it was a great opportunity for us to confer on, share opinions and on what we were seeing. I had harbored and still do reservations about some of his close-up shots of those rather unexpectedly different-looking faces. He showed me one that was then featured in this documentary for the first time, the very black-faced one he refers to sometimes as the devil face.
Yep.
That one was intriguing, much more intriguing in many ways. But I asked him about what the apparent inconsistency. How do you account for these three very different looking faces?
Even among his photos, they're extremely different.
That's what I mean.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That kind of pasty tan
Right.
one, the one with the hairy face that looks like a little Ewok.
Right. And then the devil
this
face
black
is
one that looks like a flat-faced gorilla or chimp with a flat nose and a big scar across, like a mafioso. But as I watched that dark-faced one, the details of the face, the little blemishes, the blink of the eye, that you could see the skin around the eyes very clearly. It just and then of course there are other videos that he offers as well. The one where it's running up the hillside at an angle is quite intriguing. The power that's demonstrated running up that steep incline. And trying to imagine someone encumbered in a suit with false feet, negotiating that terrain.
Sure.
But I got to know him personally. I met his family. A lot of the innuendo and rumor was dispelled. Just getting to know them and talking to them. I spent time talking with his father-in-law, who is his field assistant in many of his operations, and privately confide in him, and nothing. Todd sometimes is his own worst enemy in his exuberance. He almost he's so animated that it almost undercuts the credibility a little bit.
And he is all in, Tony. He's so all in. He's suing the state of California to recognize Sasquatch as a being. At 3/19 coming up, he has a court date.
That's great.
Right. And earlier on, before I actually met him, there had been some efforts to introduce legislation into the parliament or whatever it is in Canada. I'm not sure of the proper terminology. And at that time, I thought, well, that's, from my point of view as a scientist, that's putting the cart before the horse.
Mm-hmm.
So he must be grandstanding. He just, he's after publicity for whatever reason. But after talking with him about it, hearing his rationale and why his motivation, and a motivation that comes from his own personal experiences and not necessarily from a science background, but he seemed to be genuinely motivated out of concern for the protection, which requires the recognition of the species.
Well, someone's going to shoot one for the money. I mean, that's kind of his fear, right?
Right. Well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think that it's kind of like Grover Krantz used to advocate someone do shoot one because he felt he'd come to the conclusion, after a career of pounding on the door of, as he called it, the scientific establishment, he was convinced the only way to resolve this was with a corpse. So he advocated a $1 million reward for the first person who shot one, but $1 million fine and 10 years in prison for the second person. So, I mean, he wanted that to be the event that immediately precipitated recognition and protection and study, non-invasive types of study, but or non-threatening, hostile studies. But Todd is really motivated out of concern, I believe, and in this case, his more recent court cases, I think, are an effort to leverage through the politics. There's no getting around the fact that politicians do drive a lot of scientific research. I mean, NSF is funded by the federal government, And while it's scientists that are on the boards and panels and so forth, that institution dictates largely it dictates solely where the funding goes, and that drives research. The chances of me getting an NSF grant to look for Sasquatch are, zilch to no.
Right.
It's just not going to happen. And so, even with federal agencies where personnel are sympathetic and if not even interested and curious, there is a universal concern, a fear for the perception of how public funds are being expended. And so, I know of experiences by such personnel with supervisors who there was no grand conspiracy. It was just simply they didn't want to be called in and asked why funds are being spent to send a ranger to investigate a report of a Bigfoot. The flip side of that, or the not the flip side really, but the complement of that, or the other aspect or factor, is personal reputation and credibility. They're concerned that any perception that they're involved in any way with this will completely undercut their credibility. And, I can appreciate that after a career that has been checkered by the abuse and prejudice that has been leveled against me as a result of my involvement in this. I can fully appreciate where someone who doesn't have a vested interest would want to insulate themselves from that kind of risk to their career.
Exactly.
Job security.
Well, we're running out of time, but we want to ask a couple questions. We know that you have been archiving photos and casts of these footprints. And first of all, how's that going? And then you also have published a pair of field guides, and we want to know about those too. Yeah,
the digital archive is moving along. We've had some rough spots in the road here along the way getting it to fruition.
Right.
But eventually I want to get all of these casts digitized. And by that I mean 3D scanned, high resolution 3D scans, files archived, so that, if the Smithsonian decides they do want to do an exhibit on Sasquatch evidence, they could download, half a dozen files, and with a prototyper there in the museum, print out facsimiles just like that. But it'll also give the opportunity for other researchers and investigators to see the evidence and to study it, and not have to, bring Mohammed to the mountain here. So, and excuse me, you also mentioned the field guides. I was approached by a company that publishes these laminated multifold field guides, and they wanted to do one on Sasquatch. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but how would you do a field guide about something that's not recognized, that we can only really speculate about its behavior and so forth? But then I thought, I'm constantly being asked, how do you make a footprint cast? What should I do with this scat pile I found? How should I store and ship you this hair? And so it became a how-to for the citizen scientist, and I really think that's important.
That's great. Yeah, that's a great idea.
Great idea. Yeah.
This is not the kind of question where you can just go out in the field, and I can go out in the field and systematically, reliably collect evidence. I rely heavily on the data that amateur investigators. I use amateur in that sense of they're not professional academic wildlife biologists. Whatever. Many of them bring remarkable skills. And so I like the term citizen scientist, but their ability to identify and discriminate in the field, and then document, collect, and convey that information to me is invaluable, and I appreciate it, beyond description. And so this little field guide has been a fantastic tool to help to promote that kind of an attitude and approach, and it's reaped some benefits. So that's good.
That's great.
Doc, the very last thing I want to just say to you, or ask you, I guess, is that, Tony and I talk about it all the time. A lot of the different topics we talk about, I always end up saying, I just want to know before I die. Like the alien thing, I just want to know. I just want like definitive. I want to know. It's got to be. You've been doing this forever. You've got to really want to, a body, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, of course. I mean, I look at my predecessor Grover Krantz, and as the years passed, he was facing that prospect, and he just really wanted to have a resolution to it before he went. Unfortunately, it wasn't conclusively resolved. I mean, I think we've advanced. Anyone who seriously wants to weigh the evidence and will weigh it. There's lots of evidence to put in the scale, and I mean, anyone with an open mind and an objective attitude towards this question, I think they'll be readily convinced by the evidence at hand. But we need some sort of a type specimen, whether it's a corpse or whether someone comes in with a jaw or even a molar tooth. That will do it. That will provide the basis for the description of the new species.
I hope you get that credit. I hope you do. I hate to say that. Oh yeah, he knew about this, before he died. I would like you to get that.
Well, yeah. Well, if anyone does, I mean, it's like this was. Well. No, never mind. We'll not go there. Whoever finds it, I'll be delighted.
Right. I want you to get that recognition.
My career will be vindicated.
Yes.
All the evidence and conclusions I've drawn from the evidence will be vindicated.
That's what we want. We wish you the best with that. That's what we want.
And we'll definitely would love to have you back and talk more. But we had a great time with you. I hope our audience learned something new. And is there a place that people can find you, follow you, find your research?
Well, I do have a Facebook page and do post some announcements and whatnot on there. It's just under my full name, Don Jeffrey Meldrum. The journal is a great place. Those articles are accessible. They're free access, and they're accessible by the general public as well. And you can, I think, glean insights from that. And that's if you Google the relic hominoid inquiry, you can find that quite readily. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Meldrum, thank you so much. We appreciate you and for
Very
your
much
work
so.
and staying with it, because a lot of people do not. So thank you so much. Thank you guys for listening. We appreciate you. Go subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and listen to our podcast.
Come see us at Conscious Life Expo where Tony Sweet will be on a panel there.
Yes, I'm doing
shirtless.
One of these. Yeah.
Well, we'll see.
Nobody shows up then. But speaking of, we're doing on Sunday at 2 o'clock, I'm going to be on one of the speakers on a panel, and it's talking about the paradigm shift in media. So I'm excited about that. So until then, we'll see you next week right here on Truth Be Told. Bye.